Part 2. What does it have to say? It is, of course, a document written for a particular moment in history. Some of it became obsolete almost immediately. For instance, the tactics recommended for communists in Germany, which were not those in fact applied by them during the 1848 revolution and its aftermath. More of it became obsolete as the time separating the readers from the date of writing lengthened. Guizot and Metternich have long retired from leading governments into history books. The Tsar, though not the Pope, no longer exists. As for the discussion of socialist and communist literature, Marx and Engels themselves admitted in 1872 that even then it was out of date. More to the point, with the lapse of time, the language of the manifesto was no longer that of its readers. For example, much has been made of the phrase that the advance of bourgeoisie society had rescued a considerable part of the population from the idiocy of rural life. But while there is no doubt that Marx at this time shared the usual talisman's contempt for, as well as ignorance of, the peasant milieu, the actual and analytically more interesting German phrase referred not to stupidity, but to the narrow horizons, or the isolation from the wider society in which people in the countryside lived. It echoed the original meaning of the Greek term idiots, idiotes, from which the current meaning of idiot and idiocy is derived. A person concerned only with his own private affairs and not with those of the wider community. In the course of the decades since the 1840s, and in movements whose members, unlike Marx, were not classically educated, the original sense had evaporated and was misread. This is even more evident in the manifesto's political vocabulary. Terms such as estate, democracy, or nation, national, either have little application to the 21st century politics or no longer retain the meaning they had in the political or philosophical discourse of the 1840s. To take an obvious example, the Communist Party, whose manifesto our text claimed to be had nothing to do with the parties of modern democratic politics or the vanguard parties of Leninist communism, let alone the state parties of the Soviet and Chinese type. None of these as yet existed. Party still meant essentially a tendency or current of opinion or policy, although Marx and Engels recognized that once this found expression in class movements, it developed some kind of organization. Hence, the distinction in Section 4 between the existing working class parties, the Charterists in England and the agrarian reformers in America and the others, not yet so constituted. As the text made clear at this stage, Marx and Engels' Communist Party was no kind of organization, nor did it attempt to establish one, let alone an organization with a specific program distinct from the other organizations. Incidentally, nowhere is the actual body on whose behalf the manifesto was written, the Communist League, mentioned in it. Moreover, it is clear not only that the manifesto was written in and for a particular historical situation, but also that it represented one phase, a relatively immature phase, in the development of Marxian thought. This is most evident in its economic aspects. Although Marx had begun to study political economy seriously from 1843 onwards, he did not set out to develop the economic analysis expounded in Capital until he arrived in his English exile after the 1848 revolution and acquired access to the treasures of the British Museum Library in the summer of 1850. Thus, the distinction between the proletarian sale of his labor to the capitalist and the sale of his labor power, which is essential to Marxian theory of surplus value and exploitation, had clearly not yet been made in the manifesto. Nor did the mature Marx hold the view that the price of the commodity, labor, was its cost of production, that is, the cost of the physiological minimum of keeping the worker alive. In short, Marx wrote the manifesto less as a Marxian economist than as a communist Ricardian. And yet, though Marx and Engels reminded readers that the manifesto was a historical document, out of date in many respects, they promoted and assisted the publication of the 1848 text with relatively minor amendments and clarifications. They reorganized that it remained a major statement of the analysis which distinguished their communism from all other projects for the creation of a better society. In essence, this analysis was historical. Its core was the demonstration of the historical development of societies, and specifically of bourgeoisie society, which replaced its predecessors, revolutionized the world, and in turn necessarily created the condition for its inevitable supersession. Unlike Marxian economics, the materialist conception of history which underlay this analysis had already found its mature formulation in the mid-1840s. and remained substantially unchanged in later years. In this respect, the manifesto was already a defining document of Marxism. It embodied the historical vision, though its general outline remained to be filled in by fuller analysis.